Good afternoon. On behalf of ADA and corporate to community, I would like to thank you for joining us for today's Good Disaster Risk Governance webinar, held in recognition of the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, which was last week on October the 13th. My name is Amanda Leck, and I'm the Executive Director at the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience. I am delighted to be your host for today's webinar. I wish to start by acknowledging that I am hosting this event in the city of Yarra in Victoria from the lands of the Wurundjeri people. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians on the various lands on which you all join us from today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters across Australia. I will introduce our speaker shortly, but before I do, I would like to provide you with some brief housekeeping notes. Today's event will be recorded and made available, along with presentation slides after the event. Today we will be using the Q&A feature on Zoom to take questions, so please post your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat window. You will be able to upvote questions by clicking the thumbs up button, and I will do my best to ask a number of these speakers following the presentation. I encourage you to use the chat window to share any thoughts or reflections during the presentations, and just a reminder that you will need to select all panellists and attendees in the drop-down menu for everyone attending today to view your messages. I would also like to remind you to please be respectful to each other and our presenters when posting your comments or questions. The National Disaster Risk Reduction Framework was endorsed by COAG in March of this year. The framework is designed to guide Australia's efforts to reduce disaster risk associated with natural hazards. It sets a common agenda for collective action focused on systemic disaster risk and provides an opportunity to address climate and disaster risk at scale and at its root cause. It encompasses a whole of society approach in recognition that across a number of sectors, the decisions that have been made have the power to either create, maintain, or reduce risk. We often talk about the role of governments, be they at local, state, or Commonwealth level, in reducing disaster risk. Today's webinar will focus on good disaster risk governance from the perspectives of three business leaders. According to the ABS, more than 3/4 of jobs in Australia are in the private sector. That's 8 out of 10 employees. So how is the private sector responding to the risks they are facing with the impacts of climate change? The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures was established with the goal of developing a set of voluntary climate-related financial risk disclosures to provide consistent and transparent information to global markets. However, the risks of climate change to business are greater than just financial risk. So how is business adapting and transforming? And what can we learn about how good disaster risk governance will position business to address the risks of climate change? Good governance is about balancing the choices and trade-offs we make every day to ensure a prosperous future and so that we can thrive as a nation and become more resilient. We have three business leaders joining us for today's webinar, and I'm delighted to introduce Claire Rogers, Managing Partner, CEO Mastermind Advisory Mentor List, Sue O'Connor, the Non-Executive Chair of Yarra Valley Water, and James Ritchie, Principal Consultant Corporate to Community and International Resilience Advisor, Resilience Advisors Network. We are also joined by Renee Hamden, the founder of Corporate to Community and a leader in the private sector contribution to disaster risk. So I will now introduce our first speaker, Claire Rogers. Claire is a strategic leader with deep expertise in driving growth, innovation and transformation across a broad range of financial services and for-purposes entities. She has achieved market-leading performance through a clear understanding of business and customer context and executing at pace by developing inspiring teams, shaping culture for purpose with agility, a social innovator with entrepreneurial skills, She has successfully led large and small organisations across multiple industries to achieve growth through digital. Previously Chief Executive of World Vision Australia, the country's largest not-for-profit organisation, and with extensive global and local experience in multiple financial services divisions of ANZ, including a stint as Head of Digital Banking. She has consistently led organisations to deliver on their purpose and commercial potential. She was also the chair of Ridley College, Melbourne, where she guided the organisation to achieve a business model shift to 50% online delivery. She is currently assisting several digital and new business startups to achieve scale and managing partner of CEO Mastermind Advisory Services, and is a member of Chief Executive Women, the ARCD and Scale Investors, an angel investor network focused on female founders. Thank you very much for joining us, Claire, today.
Thank you, Amanda. The average farmer in Mozambique has never heard of climate change, yet he or she has experienced it. Mozambique had never experienced a cyclone in the history of the country, one of the poorest in the world, and their first one was a Category 4. The human toll of climate change is real. So what can we learn, and what have I learned from Mozambique and other crises like it? First, one of our greatest assets is the human spirit. It is largely resilient in the midst of terrible tragedy. We've seen that through the bushfires in Australia, and I saw it in Mozambique. Those who have little are more generous than those who have much. I met Cecilia, a young girl in Beira who lost everything in the cyclone. She was given clean clothes by another woman, and she wants to join the police force when she's old enough to support her community in a crisis. How can we leverage that strength of spirit in a disaster? It's our greatest asset. Second, it starts with relationships, and not relationships in a crisis, but those before the crisis will serve in a crisis. Relationships that are strong and trusted beforehand are much more likely to be flexible and able to work in a crisis. In the tsunami in Palu, Sigi, Indonesia, just a few years ago, World Vision's long-term trusted relationships on the ground were given permission to work where others were sent away by the Indonesian government. My message here is don't wait for a disaster to build good relationships in community, because by the time it happens, it will be too late. Point 3, local people know better and have access to networks to drive impact that a centralised structure will never have. There is a theory circulating that COVID in New South Wales has been more successfully contained because of the decentralised health system. People were able to respond quicker and better. I think it's a serious theory in my view, and I'm not going to comment on whether that's true or not, but I think that because those who are closest to the crisis can make the quickest adjustments. In Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu, the foreign experts who flew in were still holed up in a hotel planning, while local leaders had advertised on Facebook for mattresses and tarpaulins and had what they needed in 3 hours. And yes, that's digital in action as a collaboration tool in a crisis as well. The fourth thing I learnt was that prevention and preparedness is always a better investment than throwing money at the disaster itself. Another example from Vanuatu and a DFAT program to educate locals on water and sanitation. DFAT was frustrated the program was taking too long, but the prevention investment paid off when 70% of toilets and facilities were rebuilt within months of a devastating weather event without any intervention being required. So in summary, draw on the human spirit as an asset. Build the relationships you need to manage the risk before the crisis. Work with those closest to the disaster to design the response for the greatest impact. And prevention and preparedness will pay dividends in recovery pace and cost. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. Very insightful comments, and certainly I think the comments about COVID sitting here in Victoria ring true to me with regard to the importance of local networks. I'd now like to go to Sue O'Connor, the non-executive chair of Yarra Valley Water. Sue is an experienced business leader who has served as a chair, director and senior business leader with ASX top 10 companies and global unlisted companies, as well as high-profile statutory authorities and not-for-profits. Her leadership values are anchored in a commitment to ensuring that communities are prosperous, equitable and sustainable. Sue is known for her board leadership, collaborative approach, commercial acumen, strategic thinking and deep expertise in technology, climate change, low carbon economies, financial services, utilities, audit and risk. Over her 12-year board career, Sue has chaired or been a member of technology, transformation, audit, risk and customer experience committees. Sue holds a Bachelor of Applied Science and a graduate of Diploma Business Management. She is a Fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors and a member of Chief Executive Women. Thank you very much, Sue.
Thank you, Amanda. And thank you, Claire. Really enjoying following on from you. I want to take a view from a board perspective of dealing with risk in a climate change world. And this really came to the fore for me in around 2006 when the water industry was dealing with the tail end of the millennium drought. It was terrible. You know, there was just no water around on a whole lot of things. So if we roll the clock forward, the industry built expertise, capability and understanding, and also those relationships that you need to have with others. So in 2015, I became chair of Yarra Valley Water. And for those who aren't familiar with that organisation, it's the third largest water and sanitation company in Australia. It serves about 30% of Victoria's population. The water industry is one that needs to plan for 12 months and for 45 years. And so as part of our strategic planning, we brought in the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO to talk about what were the possible climate change futures as it related to water availability. They gave us scenarios of 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and 4 degrees warming. We had one of those, oh my goodness moments, because they told us that at 4 degrees, the Yarra River would stop flowing. And the Yarra River is one of the key sources, traditional sources for the provision of drinking water to 5 million people. So, that's a problem. So we started to then look at what were the possible scenarios, because at the same time as we had climate change, Melbourne was predicted to double in population by 2050. So what you can see here is doing the scenarios of what would happen at low, medium and high climate change when you coupled it with low, medium and high population growth. What this means is that if you look at the right-hand side, that by 2065, with severe climate change and high population growth, we would be short 450 gigalitres of drinking water a year. Which, to give you a sense of what that is, that's about Sydney Harbour's worth of water that we would be short of. So as a board, we needed to think about how do we mitigate this risk, because it is not acceptable to run out of water for a city such as Melbourne. So we had to deal with scenarios. And my first message is, traditionally, when you deal with risk at the board level, people come up with a plan that says, okay, this particular event is, there's a high likelihood or a low likelihood of it to occur. And when it occurs, it will have a high, medium or low impact, as if there is certainty in the future. And there is not. Because we need to be able to think about what happens if it's a low likelihood, what happens if it's a high likelihood, and so on. And that's my first message, is the future is not certain, and we need to deal with that uncertainty differently. And next slide, please. Because it's not just about water. CSIRO and the Bureau of Meteorology have provided some forward forecasts on what may happen to Australia under different climate scenarios. And if we could go back to the last slide, that would be the previous slide, that would be good. So the previous slide talks about all of the, thank you, talks about all of the different things that may be impacts. So tropical cyclones, which Claire spoke about at Mozambique, not as often, but far more severe. Harsher fire conditions. Well, Australia saw that with the black summer that we've just gone through. Decreases in winter and spring rainfall. All of these are elements. And as boards and organisations, we need to understand what those differences may be. We need to be preparing for how do we respond to try and mitigate, build resilience, and hopefully mitigate and reduce the amount of carbon that we as organisations are contributing to the global atmosphere. Next slide, please. So my message to you is that if your business is impacted by natural climate, and I would suggest that almost everyone's is, you need to think about those scenarios. You need to think about what are the multiple likelihoods of event and the impact assessments of those likelihoods, because a low impact could be different from a high impact in how it is that you control for it. Because to build disaster risk resilience, you need to be able to understand, assess, and confidently deal with an uncertain future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue. And thank you. I'm sure that as a water utility organisation, you're at the forefront of this thinking with regard to the impacts of climate risk. And I would remind our audience today to use the Q&A box. We've already heard from two of our speakers, and they've had some very insightful thoughts to share with us on this issue of good governance for disaster risk. So please start putting your questions into the Q&A, and we will get to those after our last speaker. I'd now like to introduce our final speaker, James Ritchie, who is a principal consultant with Corporate to Community and an international advisor on resilience with the Resilience Advisors Network. James brings diverse senior leadership experience from the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors. He has also had executive leadership accountability and expertise in disaster risk and resilience, governance, and strategy. James has held various disaster preparedness and emergency management responsibilities across his career. James holds an MBA and an international diploma in humanitarian assistance from Fordham University, New York, USA, and has completed expert training in disaster risk reduction and management in Berlin. Currently, James is based in Germany and is a principal consultant for Corporate to Community and an international resilience advisor for the Resilience Advisors Network in Europe. And thank you, James, for joining us today from Germany in what I'm sure is a very different time zone to here on the east coast of Australia.
Thanks, Amanda. That's, yeah, and it certainly is. Yeah, thanks, Amanda. That's fantastic. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, it's wonderful to be here today, and thanks very much to both Ada and Corporate to Community, and to just thank the previous speakers. But one thing before I start is Sue is right on the money with the thinking about climate change and thinking about risk in particular, because as an ex-water industry executive, that's the very thing I used to see all the time around how we're going to look at risk in a different way. And this was also confirmed to me. I visited the Climate Change Institute in Potsdam, Germany recently, and they said the exact same as well. I'll just get someone to put up my slides, please. But the three areas that I will be focusing on today is disaster risk governance in a new era of disasters. Thank you. Disaster risk governance and leadership, because I think that's an important area. And then just some international observations. As we have got limited time today, I'll keep my presentation as brief as possible, I hope, but more as a thought prompter and teaser for you to get involved during the Q&As, which I personally find very interesting, so we can get the burning issues and topics and share them and discuss them together. So just if I have my first slide, please. Thank you. So the thing for me is, one of the things instead I've been in diverse organisations and diverse sectors and internationally, is working together is now my view that we have to do it better going forward. That's obviously been evidenced in the recent pandemic. But if you think about the compounding disasters we're having around the world, it's going to be not so much the way we work, it has to be the way we work. So I see that the key areas in that are around, particularly for governance, is role clarity for organisations and for individuals for that matter. I think the private sector has a major role to play, from SMEs to the corporates, but we need to reimagine partnering in a different way. I mean, to be honest, in my time in government, not-for-profits and the private sector, we all talk about partnering and working together, but in fact, it's just a contractual arrangement. I think we need to rethink about how we do things collectively. When I have seen it, it doesn't happen enough when it's in the way it's sort of put together and designed, co-designed, and it's more of a contractual arrangement. Where I see working together, we have to build much better trusted networks, skills, capacities, and capabilities to do this. I recognise people will say, oh, but it takes resources and time and money. That is absolutely correct. But I do think if we need to build resilience, we need to think about how will we thrive and survive, both at the organisational level, the community level, then the local, regional and international levels. For me, as I said, I've come from very diverse sectors, and one of the key things I see, and it sort of links in with the previous speakers, is we need to get better at integrated strategic planning. It needs to be a whole of business integration. We need to, leading by example with good scenario modelling, as Sue had recently said. It drives good strategy and policy, both for government policy, organisational policies, and community, the way the community operates with each other. When I look at it these days, after many years in disaster risk and resilience, as well as previous executive experience, I see that strategy, risk and governance must include a whole of business approach. And we need to think about doing disasters differently. We need to think about changing the scope of our planning and our strategy development and implementation. It must include disaster planning in a very different way. To be blunt, I think, you know, that area of business planning has been in some ways a token approach just to make sure we have business continuity. It has to be bigger and more across the whole of the organisation, and then impacting in other stakeholders and what it does for your business, but also what it does for your community. We have to move from being output driven and process driven. We have to be outcome focused. I think that's a key thing, is we want to tick boxes, we want to have project tasks, but if we really truly want to be able to thrive and survive in these areas of disasters, we have to look at more of what's the outcome focus. The next slide, please. We need to think about how what shared responsibility is. We need to talk about it, what role it is, whose is it, what does it mean? It's been around for a long time as a theme within disasters and emergency management, but with the business sector, I think it's not particularly well understood, and I think we need to take some time and work on what that really means for all stakeholders and actually do it. I think we need to reform the way we do our procurement across both governments and with private sector. It has to be more on a risk-based approach and embedded into business as usual, so we can respond to both business as usual and in times of crisis. And I believe all businesses must maximise their governance frameworks with less box ticking and compliance for compliance sake. We need to think about at all levels that leadership matters. You know, the major gaps that I see in leadership, if you think of all reviews and inquiries and investigations people have done. I think there's gaps between what's the models of decision making, emotional and moral intelligence. They drive, in my view, they drive better value decision making before, during and after. It also strengthens resilience in the long term for both for businesses, communities and individuals. I think at the end of the day, culture is a definite issue we need to deal with, both at the organisational level, country level and geographic level. I think the collaboration between stakeholders, between the business sectors amongst themselves, amongst with government, is an area with stakeholder engagement has to really seriously look at how we actually build those trusted networks, but how do we actually engage with each other. I think, as I said, I've been in many sectors and many areas, and I think one of the key learnings for me is we actually can learn from each other. I must admit, I get slightly frustrated when I see some great things happening in the business world and they're not shared with government, or the government, they're not shared with business, or the not-for-profit and the NGOs, the humanitarian sector or the disaster sector with the business sector. We've got so much cross-learning and cross-sharing to do. And to date, for me, the major focus of resilience has been predominantly capital infrastructure and those types of issues for, to cut ribbons for ministers and things like that. I think we need to change that around to think about what's the social capital and its impact as a result, and what are the true needs in communities, and how do we build local capacity in preparing, responding and recovering from disasters. I think that's a key area that we have to move in. And I think all businesses have a role to play, and they need to play. They're very important, while actively being part of the conversation to design, solve and respond to this new area of disasters. I think they need to be clearly integrated in that process. Next slide, please. So this is now just some of my observations. I'm I said, a diverse executive that's been doing disasters and risk resilience governance work for many, many years. Recently, sort of 18 months ago, I came to Europe, based in Europe for a while, just to think about what and to observe what's happening in other parts of the world. One of the things I'd noticed in my previous travels here and my business meetings here was that they were having strategic discussions differently. They were thinking about some of the key issues. I'm not saying that everybody had the answers here, but they were talking in a very different strategic risk approach than I was hearing, both in government and in businesses in Australia. They were clearly connected to the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, Paris Agreement. They're quite new concepts, I think, in Australia. I think they're starting to come on board, but I think they need to sort of ramp them up and understand them more. I think more needs to be done in that strategic risk approach and the themes of risk, and how do we manage risk better, and how do we prioritize for it. It can no longer be a tick and flick list. I think it has to be evidence-based scenario planning. I think we need to build local capacity across the world. I'm a big advocate for local capacity, but I think that's in every area of the world. I think at the end of the day, the local people in the local areas know how to respond, and we need to build capacity. And I think they're ready for that. In fact, I think they're driving it greater than the other side of the equation. I think governments, I've noticed in international context, particularly across Europe, they're trying to get the policy levers correct. It has greater complexity across Europe because of you take Germany, for example, has 16 states, but then there's also an overlay of the European Union. But I do think it has a greater view of how do we actually get the cohesion of policy correct, and how does it benefit community and business. And then I think then businesses are responding to what do our policies need to be better than that I have seen that in Australia. I think also because of the large international donor programs, particularly across Europe and the US, I think there's greater interest in international donors learning from each other and from both the developed world and the developing world. So just the next slide, please. In my closing comments, really, my view is collectively Australian businesses with many other parts of the world are not yet on the same page, but they are all willing and able with great capacity to lead and make a valuable contribution in working together to design, innovate and solve the complex issues that compounding of complex disasters bring. With great leadership combined with exemplary governance, stakeholder engagement, we will be well placed to reduce disaster risk while strengthening resilience in our communities and businesses that makes the new era of disasters. We are facing challenging times and these will not go away. I believe Australia can be a true global leader with local partners as they are well placed to lead and make a difference. So I'll leave it there and I look forward to having a robust and interesting Q&A. Back to you, Amanda. Thank you.
Thanks very much, James, and thanks for that international perspective as well. And I think your comments about the international donor community and learning from each other are probably something perhaps that Australia hasn't been so much part of, given our proximity or lack of proximity to that part of the world. Look, I'd like to welcome all our panellists back on screen now, and I'd also like to at this point introduce Renee Hanbin, who is our partner with regard to corporate to community for today's webinar. Many of you will know Renee. She is the founder of Corporate to Community and a leader in private sector contribution before, during and after disasters. She's most known for doing disasters differently, and Renee helps corporates, SMEs, governments and communities build disaster resilience to all hazards. So welcome, Renee. We've had a number of questions in the Q&A, so keep those coming. But I'll go to the first question. So what conversations are being had around the board table about training staff across all levels on disaster risk reduction and disaster planning? And how do you get your staff to adopt your disaster risk reduction policies and plans? So perhaps I might go to Sue first for that question.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. So around the board tables that I'm involved with, I would say that it's framed in a different way. So the conversations are around what are our highest risks, and for some of them they are doing the scenario-based risk assessment, which I'm talking about, which then flows through to how do you deal with those risks to reduce them, which then flows through to what are the capabilities that you need to have inside your organisation. So it's not so much about are we doing training program X or Y, it's about do we have the right resources and the right plans in place to control the risks that we've identified that are really quite high. And that was interesting to watch the water industry over 14 years to go through that process. And I'm seeing that with other organisations now.
Claire, from your experience on the boards that you sit on, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think one of the things I've observed is the need to distinguish between risks and issues. So once you've actually got a crisis, we're pretty good at rallying around and dealing with what life throws at us. It's not as comfortable a place for boards to sit, to be in the open risk space. So like Sue, I think scenario planning helps bring it to life, but also not to get into operational management. The questions that are asked are the most important thing. So things like, do we have the relationships at the level we need for an event that we might have on our risk register? The other thing I'd say is that I think a lot of organisations, corporate and not-for-profit, tend to focus on the risks that directly impact their organisation. And I think there's obviously enormous value. How many people had a pandemic on their risk register? How many organisations? There's enormous need to have the macro level global risks and then step down into what is specific to business risks. And most organisations have solved COVID and the pandemic in terms of operating, but it was a rushed, and you saw a lot of very tired people working out what to do very, very quickly. And that's not a great place if you can plan for those. And I'd point to something that's been around for a very long time, but Shell globally has been the masters of scenario planning. They still do it every year. They look at the macro trends, and you can take that, it's in the public domain, you can take that and apply that to your organisation and then flow through into what the implications would be.
Thanks very much, Claire. And I could see you nodding furiously there, James. So I think you would like to add to that.
Yeah, if I could, it's interesting being both on boards and an executive over the years. I think what from an engagement point of view, the boards have that strategic view and the operational view, but it's actually about engagement and leadership. And I think what happens in my view is the way we actually encourage that is, how do we get the organisation to think strategically, not just about operations, and how do we cascade that through the business and then get them to understand the communities they're involved with? How do they actually understand what's needed as a business, but also how does it actually impact the communities they serve or deal with?
Thanks, James. I think this next question is related, but it's about that understanding or maturity of knowledge about climate and disaster risk at the governance level. So, what do you think that maturity of knowledge is in Australia? And perhaps, James, you can comment more internationally. And what do you think would help to build that knowledge base?
I'll start.
Yep.
So I think if I look at climate change, the answer is it varies. Some are very mature in their understanding and assessment of the risks and the opportunities, because I think it's always important to think about the opportunities as well. So I think that they're really mature around that. In terms of disaster risk, again, it's not disaster risk per se, but it is what are the potential issues that we may have. And so, for example, at the moment, for insurance companies who have been under for a long time now, recognising the risks associated with climate change, it is becoming increasingly difficult to get insurance if you have property or assets that are north of Brisbane here in Australia, because the risks are now so high. So I think that it varies. It varies. Very mature in some areas, developing in others.
And Claire, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, I just had the point that as boards are often, the strength of boards is it's a diverse group and a small focus group, essentially. When boards get too big, they become unwieldy and hard to drive the organisation forward. And you can get caught in this trap of you need every single skill around the table, but that's not humanly possible. And so I wouldn't encourage us to think about, unless perhaps in your case, Sue, you're definitely in an environmental organisation, there'll be technical skills you would need around the table. But if we're then trying to add a disaster risk specialist to every board table, that's not going to be practical, right? So this is about the skills of questioning and thinking and reflection and personal learning that directors go through to equip them to play that role on the board.
Thanks very much, Claire. And James, I think, you spoke earlier about the maturity that you're seeing across the European sector that you're working with. Would you like to talk about that level of maturity?
Yeah, I will. It's because it was quite stark for me. It was when I first came here, I had meetings all across Germany, Netherlands, France. It was very, very interesting, the conversations both at board level and senior executive level about what they were thinking about in their strategic risk. It was interesting. Lots of them said, we're not quite sure that the answer is yet, but it was telling to me that those issues were getting on the table from a strategic thinking point of view on the opportunities and the impact of what they meant to them. And they were thinking of them in the lenses of what's the impact to our people, what's the impact to our economies, what's the impact to our business, of course, but they have a very different thinking of strategic risk. And I agree. I think it was with Sue, with Claire, you can't get, we can't say, oh, we need to have a position on every board around risk management. It's actually about how do we bring the whole board to think more strategically about the opportunities to the business, but also the risks to the business and the risks to the communities they work in.
I might go go to you as well, Renee, because you work with a lot of SMEs in this space that perhaps don't have the luxury of, boards with, terrific qualifications and so on. So what do you think the maturity of those smaller businesses are around some of these matters?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. So I'd say the maturity is very low, if existent at all. And speaking to so many small businesses impacted by the bushfires and then obviously COVID on top, I mean, those who have survived or who will survive, all they're asking for is knowing what to do. And I think a lot of the great work that the likes of Sue and Claire obviously is, and James are activating at that high board level, it's needed at the grassroots level as well. And it's needed in the sense to be, these small and medium business owners need to be taught, and they need to be have processes and systems that enable them to activate it into their everyday business as usual, given the fact that they're time poor, they're cash poor, and most of them don't even want to run a business anyway. They just want to deliver on their skill set. So I think there's a big opportunity for both corporates to think about how they can service their customers who are small businesses as well, but also as a nation, how we look at helping the SME market in this space definitely as well.
Thanks, Renee. This question, I think it expands a little bit on what you said earlier, Claire, that you don't need every board member to be an expert in disaster risk. You need boards to have that sort of broad strategic view and understand the context in which they're operating. But specifically, what skills, knowledge and experience do you think board or even committee of management members need to help to start to think about disaster risk and embedding it into their operations and decision making? And also, are they even questions that boards are asking? When you're recruiting for a new board member, is that the sort of, interview technique? Is that one of the questions you're now asking of future board members? So perhaps to you, Claire, first.
Yeah, look, I think risk generally, absolutely. If you think about the level of obligations that have increased on directors playing a leadership role in organisations over the last kind of 10 years, I actually think the challenge is to get directors to think strategically, because there's so many risks that they want covered and cleared, and they want to sleep at night, which is entirely valid, and I fully support that, having been a director myself. You want to sleep at night knowing that the risks are covered. But it's sort of like James is saying, that you can do all of that ironing out and miss the bigger risks or the bigger strategic issues coming at you. And so, I don't know the answer. I think it's about hiring smart people. I think it's about hiring people that are risk conscious, but also know how to live with risk, the ambiguity of risk, because you cannot mitigate everything away. So it's about that kind of wisdom to figure out, are they going to be right around the table and be able to balance some of these things that have to sit in tension?
Thank you. And Sue, you chair the Yarra Valley Water Board. So when you're recruiting for new board members, is this on your radar? Is that the sort of questions you're asking them around risk, as Claire has talked about?
I think there's two sides to any time you're recruiting for directors. One is, what are the skills and capabilities that you believe your board needs around the table? And it will be a mixture. There'll be a mixture of those, because it's the sum of the whole that's important. Because you typically don't want to have just one person who has a high priority skill for you, IT, for example. But the other side is about how is it that they will operate? Do they have an inquiring mind? Do they understand how to appropriately assess both opportunities and risk, and be able to work out how to pursue or control it? How do they work with the directors that are around the table? Because you don't need to always agree. And in fact, if you always agree, it's not working well. But do they take that inquiring mind and do it in a way that is productive, professional and respectful?
Thanks very much, Sue. So James, you spoke about the requirement for disaster planning. So what conversations are you seeing where they're actually planning across that whole of the emergency management cycle? So they're looking at prevention and preparedness, quite specifically as part of their planning.
It was interesting It's actually a bit about, some of it's a bit about intelligence gathering. One of the interesting things I've noticed here is that, you know, we do have a very complex relationships across both Germany and in Europe. But what I found interesting talking to businesses when they're thinking about this stuff now is they're actually at a grassroots level actually getting people to come and speak to them about what are the issues. So I was at a forum the other day with the equivalent of the SES here, which is called the THV. And it was interesting where the business leaders were asking them, what do we need to do? How do we need to plan? Our current planning process is X or Y. How do we embed and how do we think about the things? Because lots of them strategically are saying, how do we get the opportunity of getting better at this for our people and our communities and our businesses? But a lot of them are sitting there saying, well, how do we actually get the expertise around the table on the areas that we don't know about? So lots of them are asking for, how do we get better networks and get the people in? Like I was talking to one of the larger organizations here, and they actually got their board actually got their insurers in, but also got the government departments in to ask them questions about, so what would happen if this happens? And it was an interesting dialogue about how they're doing it and how they're thinking about it. And then internally they're asking themselves, okay, if this is the things that can impact us, what part of the process needs to change for us? What type of leadership needs to change for us? And then they look at what's the framework and what's the policy internally about how do we put this front and center in our business? And I've seen that sort of 2 or 3 times here where they've said, okay, everything we do needs to have an overlay of any policy that we do for the business that meets particularly an international obligation, but also impactful in the sense of disasters. Do we have a lens when we do our internal corporate policy check? Do we have a lens that says, yep, that's taken into consideration? So that's how lots of them are doing it here.
Okay, thanks, James. I think this is an interesting question from someone who's online from the university sector, asking what are the key skills and knowledge gaps that you as experienced leaders think are missing and that universities could help provide for those at the industry level? So, you know, you spoke earlier about clever people. So, you know, what are those skills that you're seeing that are missing to confront the challenges we face in the future?
Well, there's a couple of ways I could answer that. One is from something I'm quite passionate about, the role of digital and IT in transforming risks, actually, and transforming customer experience. And I think, you know, that's starting to be well documented now. The AICD has been talking about the need for those skills on boards because the next generation, they don't understand a life without those being the way that they do things. So that's one area, but related to that is this way of, you know, I learnt it through understanding and starting to lead through an agile leadership framework, but and there's many different models for it now, but that real, how do you empower people to respond to the context that are closest to the context as opposed to our traditional hierarchical models. And I think that there's real potential. I haven't thought about this deeply, so if someone wants to take it offline and I can give some more thought to it, but I think there is a need for leadership training that starts to shift those models and really challenge leaders to think about different ways of leading their teams and empowering, rather than the old hippo, highest paid person in the room, making the decisions that aren't necessarily then proven in market to be the right way to go.
Thanks very much there. Yeah, thank you. Would you like to comment on that, Sue, as well, from what you're seeing as the gap?
So I think a classic, just to build on what Claire is saying, when you think about people examining strategic risks and what are the controls, you have this, and I spoke about it a little bit in my talk. You have, what is the likelihood of this event occurring, and what is the impact of that event occurring, as if it is a binary and absolute number, and that the world was that certain. is because it's about the scenarios. And so we need people to be adaptive and responsive to know that that's not like that. And how do we deal with that? And I think that one of the really positive things that's come out of COVID is that people needed to make decisions really fast on really incomplete information. And it was a great, and it was done in an incredibly stressful time, a lot of exhausted people and so on. But what it was it was about that the perfect is the enemy of the good. And so how do we build environments and capabilities to deal with uncertainty, to deal with incomplete information, to have an environment that allows people to back out decisions when that decision, which was made on the best information that you had available, turns out to be wrong. Those types of things.
I heard an interesting term the other day. I'm going to put my own question in here now, around COVID being a black elephant event. So, you know, we talk about these black swan events, which comes from, you know, when the British came to Australia, they saw black swans and, you know, they couldn't believe that swans were black in the Southern Hemisphere. So the notion of the black elephant event was it was the elephant in the room. Plenty of very clever people had said that we were going to be facing a global pandemic, and that goes back probably 10 or 15 years. Yet clearly Australian or the global community was prepared for it. So I'm going to put you on the spot a bit. Had your boards thought about, or the organisations you work with, did they have pandemic on their risk registers, or had you given it any consideration?
No and no.
Yeah, no.
Internationally, the answer is, particularly across Europe, the answer is yes, but it was just on the risk. It was just on the register. If you actually asked them, has it been tested? What do we need to know about it? What do we do about it? How do we respond to it? It was very thin.
So,
and I think that was also, James, you talked about it the other day, driven by relationships with Africa and the diseases in Africa, like Ebola, which are hugely terrible death rates, fortunately not as virulent as COVID. So it was still born out of, you know, the migration of people and the risks coming from the migration of people. So, you know, even though it was on their registers, it was coming from probably that level I was talking about, which is their own business challenges. And so I think, you know, that the training that maybe universities could start to look into is really how do you build a rich risk management framework that starts at that, you know, and I know it's hard to comprehend at a global level, but then brings it down to how do I make those risk reward trade-offs. The other thing I think, I want to just come back, Amanda, to that question around training. One of the challenges with the risk systems we have in organisations and even at boards is we want to close every risk. Back to Sue's point around perfection, we want to close it out completely and then we can move on to the next risk. Life doesn't work like that, and the cost of closing that down to the tiniest, you know, mitigated risk is an opportunity cost for other things that you can invest in. And so I think there's a real opportunity to strengthen strategic risk management where commercial trade-offs, they have to be part of the conversation. I know we all want it to be perfect, but it can't be. And what are you willing to trade for closing a risk versus allowing a little bit of openness, good being the appropriate way forward? And
I think the other thing as well is that we can't control all risks. We can't identify all risks. We can't mitigate all risks and so on. But what we can do is what are the skills and capabilities we have to apply from one risk to another. And so while I said no and no on pandemic and were we prepared for pandemic, what the organisations that I'm involved in had a lot of maturity in cybersecurity and in bushfires in particular. So neither of those are exactly the same as what we're dealing with in a pandemic, but gee, there's an awful lot of skills and capabilities that you can apply. And I think we need to be, I keep on saying perfect is the enemy of good. And that includes, you can have, if you have a strategic risk list that is got 20 things on it, you'll do all of them badly. But if there's 6 on it and there turns out to be a 7th pandemic, how do you ensure that you have your organisation is adaptive and resilient enough to be able to take some of its skills, apply it in this new area, and be open to what are the new things we need to learn and do?
Thank you.
Can I just say a couple of quick words there, Amanda? Just going back, one thing what's noticeable in here, and it could be because of the international world of donors and the international work. One thing, the international NGOs across Europe, particularly in Germany, were well placed and well prepared, and lots of businesses went to them to actually get advice. Like, the German Red Cross, they've got a base in Berlin. They are ready to respond to a major pandemic or an Ebola event within 4 hours. They were very instrumental in helping both government and businesses to understand how to think about some of these issues. And to go back to the skills gap, one of the key issues I see, and they're trying to get here, is about diversity of people and of experience, and then how do we get the voice of the different people on boards and in executives that can be both influenced and can influence. It's one of the key things. One of the things I've seen over many years is we recruit to task, not outcome. And so how do we get the people focused on the right outcome?
Look, I think this is a fascinating discussion. I could keep you on all afternoon having this conversation, but I'm going to pose one last question. I'm going to, ask if you could each make a comment on it. One of ADA's key roles is to share knowledge so that we can build capacity around becoming a more disaster resilient Australia. James previously spoke about silos, but James, you've just spoken about NGOs assisting, private sector and other entities. So what do you think is one thing, that people on this call today could do to, help another sector, another business, another entity they work with to become more aware of climate risk and its impact on their business or organisation? And how could they help them to learn and transform? So how can we break down those silos and work more collaboratively? And I'll go to Claire first, and I'll ask you all.
Well, it's hard to choose one. That's the challenge. But I think if you have a voice that can be used in this area to encourage others to understand what needs to be done and how to do it, then it should be used. I mean, I think about the example of the Red Cross sharing knowledge across industries, but it's also about, climate change. We didn't want to discuss this, and I don't know. I think the pandemic has meant that climate change is less of a debate now, and more about, this other thing that we've got to deal with in the midst of a pandemic. And so I think it's become less political to discuss, and the human impacts of climate change are starting to become more important than what was very much an environmental debate. So I would encourage organisations that have, something to share in this space to use their voice.
Thank you very much, Claire. And to Sue?
I'm a very big believer in less is more. And so I think for each person, if you can think of one thing that you think might assist someone else, and that you have as your expertise, passion and superpower. So it might be about providing more information about climate change. It might be about demonstrating how it is that you can build resilience and sharing information so that others who are in a like similar situation can use that capability. So it's about, each of us have a choice, and the thing that we have that is most finite is our time and passions. So let's just choose the thing that we're going to commit to focusing on.
Thanks very much, Sue. And to James?
Yeah, that's a big question, Amanda. But I think the one thing is for me is we're all leaders, so let's lead. So find that, as Sue was saying, one passion. How do we connect to someone else? How do we reach out? How do we all make ourselves available? Like for me on this call, if anybody wants to reach out and have another conversation about how do we connect people, how do we do, just reach out, because we're all grappling with the same issues. We're all thinking about what does it mean to us. So let's just lead. You don't have to be the top of the tree, and how do we actually then coach and mentor someone else? And how do we collaborate across the line?
And to Renee.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, I think it's inclusive relevance. So if we can invite more people to be part of the conversation and they can contribute in a way that's relevant to them. And I love what Sue says, being that everyone owns their own piece of the pie, but let's enable everyone to come and talk about their piece of the pie so we can put together the bigger picture and remove the siloed focus that we have.
Thanks, Renee. And from my perspective, because I've got to answer my own question, running more of these sorts of webinars that bring together, people such as yourselves with your expertise to share your knowledge. I mean, I'm so grateful to you all for giving us, your time both today and in the lead up to today, and being generous with your time and your expertise. So thank you so much. And I'm now going to go to Renee, who's going to do some closing remarks and a presentation on the work she's doing. So thank you very much to Sue and to Claire and to James. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I was going to say, I won't do a presentation at all. No, I just like to firstly thank Amanda and Ada. It's so wonderful to have a department who has a national focus on resilience that the likes of corporate to community can align with. So corporate to community is obviously about activating businesses in the disaster resilience space, and having Ada there to do it with us as well, it's great. So we look forward to working with them on a lot of future initiatives. This is just the first one. A massive thank you to Sue and Claire and James. We're all about starting the conversation. I think there's so much to learn in the space, and today's conversation has thought-provoked me in a lot of different areas as well. I also invite, if you can think about the two things that you learned and also the two things that you're going to do, because we all can make small steps that can actually make a big difference. So on behalf of Ada and C2C, thank you so much for joining us today. Ada's team's going to send out a survey. Please complete it. And if there's any questions or comments or future discussions that you'd like to have that be considered, we'd definitely like to start more conversations in this space as well. So thank you so much, and it's been a pleasure, and stay safe, and we'll see you soon.